Okay, welcome to my studio. I'm Chester Liwosz. I'm the project archaeologist with the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph project, and I'm here to talk some archaeology just for public lands. And since our founding in the 1990s, we have been recording continuously on the Mesa. Our recording efforts are run by volunteers. Our volunteers in the last over 20 years now have recorded some 60,000 images and counting. Um, and the number keeps going up. So I actually am still processing the data that we have coming in from last year's team's recording. But yeah, we can expect that 60,000 to keep inching up. And that doesn't even cover the whole Mesa. And that's the beautiful thing, is that we've been doing this for some, over 20 years now. Although obviously I'm new to the project. I haven't been around here for 20 years, but yeah, after 20 years of hard work, there's still just as much left to go, if not more. So um, we've, if you think of it's a flat tableland, right? And it's got two main sides, so it's shaped kind of like a canoe, where it's wide in the middle and narrow on the ends. We've covered about 2/3 of one of those sides, or what we call the east escarpment. So there's really no telling how much more there is left to do, and that it's for sure a lot. Um, so that's the general background information. Um, and so I figure I'll talk a little bit more about some of the history of the Mesa, but I'm also going to be taking questions live on air. So if you want to pop into the YouTube chat, I'm also I know that embedding and live streaming videos from YouTube onto Facebook doesn't really work too well. We're going to work on solutions in this in the immediate future, but for today, I'll be monitoring both Facebook and YouTube. So if you have any questions as I'm going along, feel free to ask, and I'll hop on I'll hop on and reply. Otherwise, I'll be giving a little bit of detail about the history of the Mesa. And typically we begin this with deep time and move forward. We begin with the formation of the Mesa some 3.4 to 3.5 million years ago with a massive lava flow. We go through about 440,000 years ago, the Rio Grande starts flowing and cutting down through. So you've got this flat lava flow, and then the Rio Grande starts cutting down into it, creating the Mesa. And this is usually the story we get into, but what we don't really talk too much about is a lot of the post-contact period happenings at the Mesa. Although many of our docents do share information about that. So I'm not trying to say that this is neglected information by any chance, but that this is maybe a story that's worth telling, as well as I want to talk about some of the research that's recently occurred on the Mesa, as well as some of the upcoming research. And so this is where part of my own interest and involvement with the project come along. So those are also stories that maybe you don't necessarily hear about the active research if you come for a tour, for example. So yeah, to begin with, the properly we call it the post-contact period. There's an older term which is more widely used, which is the historic period. And we don't use the word historic period because it implies that the oral histories of the people who are already living here are invalid. When we do learn a lot from those stories, but there's also, the term can be used as a heuristic, and that heuristic being after Euro-American contact. And that's what we're talking about today. That's why we properly call it the post-contact period. So in the immediate post-contact period, beginning 1598 with the arrival of Juan de Oñate, things don't immediately just flip and change the way that we often imagine them to. There was a period of, in fact, several decades of tensions back and forth, of cooperation and conflict between the pueblos in this area, the Tewa pueblos and the Tiwa pueblos, with the Spanish colonists. So we can't necessarily say that Spanish influence just took over 1598. Some of the things that we attribute to the period just prior to that, what here along the northern Rio Grande we call the Classic period. And I'm sorry if there happens to be a Mayanist watching, I know, different time frame, just bear with me. But yeah, what we call the Classic period here, which is immediately running up to that point of contact, a lot of those lifeways, and so a lot of the petroglyphs from that time are kind of the same for the first few years. So it's hard to tell when we see these. We might assign them to that pre-contact period because they don't necessarily have obvious post-contact contents. Like, and I'm pulling up some examples to show you of the obvious post-contact content versus prior to. Yeah, so here we go. Here is a petroglyph from, there we go. This is what we call one of our animal flute players. They're fairly unique to Mesa Prieta. There's a few that show up in Arizona, I think some in southern Utah, but really we don't see large concentrations of them except at Mesa Prieta. So this is one of the cool, unique things about this location. So this is what I'm talking about with Classic period images. This is steeped in Pueblo traditions from the style of flute that's being played, which is it's an end-blown flute. And I'm not going to do a demonstration because I can't play an end-blown flute. I've got an overbite, so I can't actually blow on the end properly. But you blow on it the way that you would a bottle top, or the top of a beer bottle. And of course it has keys, as you would expect. Yeah, so this is a Pueblo style. Okay, so Amy Crane asks, how are these particular petroglyphs made? Are the techniques used that are unique to the region? The general way that these petroglyphs are made, like this one, there we go. If you can see, there's a bit of stippling to the way that the image is made. This one is done with fine detail, but it's still done with a bit of stippling. So what they would do is they would take a stone implement. We're gonna use my knife as a stand-in, usually because it's usually tapered on the end, and they're probably doing an indirect percussion method, which is tapping it on the top with the point. This gives you very fine control. We have other examples of other techniques. So we have, and this is one of the things that shows up in the historic period. And I'm just, I have to scroll through a few things here. But we'll, there we go. There we go. Here we go. And this is going to be hard to see. This is what we call This is what we call a scratched technique. This is probably post-contact, but we can't be certain. It's hard to see, but it's a figure of a person. So you can kind of see the shoulders, sort of triangular tapered body, and one of the legs. Um, here's an example of a different technique. So this is something that we do see show up with that Spanish Spanish colonial contact. Is rather than using that stippling technique, these are incised, probably with a sharp implement like a knife, and actually gouging into the rock. So working it a bit more than with the scratching technique. And then we also have here we go, abraded images, and this one's going to be really hard to see, but you can see there's the darker surface of the rock. We call that the patina, and in the middle there's a lighter spot where the patina's been rubbed away. So this is the remaining basic technique. We don't really have a lot of painted images. We might have 2 or 3. They still need to be sort of confirmed. They're not in our database yet, but we think we do have a couple of painted ones. But for the most part, most of the Pueblo images are done with that pecking technique, with tapping that chisel into the stone surface. These techniques, one group might use multiple techniques, but sometimes they might prefer a particular one. So when we hit that post-contact period, everything's in flux. Everybody's moving around, right? Because there's so much conflict, we have many Native American groups displaced from their original homelands and moving along elsewhere. This happens with the Comanche, and the Comanche come through and have made petroglyphs on the Mesa. One of the ways that we can tell a Comanche petroglyph is that it's going to be scratched. But another way that we can tell is that it's going to be, is the subject matter. Comanche subject matters often involve horses. So this is a post-contact image. This is not done with a pecking technique. This appears to be done with a bit of incising, and the reason why it looks stippled is because the rock surface is a bit uneven. So the techniques may not necessarily in themselves be unique to this area, but they can certainly tell us a lot about the story of the people who made them. Now, some of the ways that these techniques are applied uniquely. So we have abrading. There's abraded surfaces all over the world. There are traditions of using abrading in Native American rock art, especially in the West, especially in spots where you're trying to prep a grinding surface. Something unique we see to this area, though, or at least that I haven't encountered in other areas that I've worked, is taking an existing petroglyph panel, already has image. Think of in the archaeological record of this are from a vastly different time and place, from the Upper Paleolithic caves in what is now France. There were panels of pictographs, so petroglyphs carved into the stone. Pictographs are painted images, and there are pictographs in the Upper Paleolithic caves that have been abraded away, and there's a roughly rectangular area that's been prepared for new images to be put on it. So we see that kind of happening with the petroglyphs here, and this is actually one of the avenues of research that we haven't yet explored. So we have lots of opportunities for research here. We are trying to launch new research, but there are more questions than we have people and time to be able to address. So this is going to be a gold mine for data for years to come. No actual gold, though. That's a myth. Don't go looking for gold. It's not there. But yeah, okay. So yeah, good question, and thank you for that question. again, yeah, some of that stuff, it's not that the particular technique is unique to the region, but the way that it's used is. And yeah, I guess where I'm kind of like circling back on that is different demographic groups start interacting in new ways in that post-contact time, especially after we have the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, which the Pueblos essentially regained independence from Spanish colonial rule for a 12-year period from 1680 to 1692. That's something I'll maybe circle back around to. But after that, so we've got after 1690, there's a lot of changes that happen. We start to see more ranching happen on the mesa, so we get images that look like cattle brands. And there's going to be another one of those where it's going to take a minute to pull up, but yeah, I'll pull that up, and we're going to hopefully run this smoother in by pre-preparing some of the presentation, and then just taking questions live on air after the presentation's been loaded up. So yeah, I'm scrolling through to try to find. Not quite that one. Oh, here we go. Okay. So here is, hopefully this will be clear. Here's a drawing that our recorders did of a panel on a piece of private property on the mesa, and though these figures very much resemble registered cattle brands from the late 19th and early 20th century. The panel may predate that. The panel is quite possibly from either the 18th or the 19th century, versus the records that we found so far are post-dated, but they're actually very compelling candidates for being cattle brands. So these images were made with the pecking technique, and yet they're of a new type of thing. They're representing completely different ideas put in a different context. They're in a different part of the mesa, representing different ideas, a different sort of visual lexicon. So we're seeing this influence of a cultural shift, but sometimes we also see some continuity in these. So we might find those images on a panel, a rock surface, that has pre-contact, classic period images. And that really raises some good questions about why are they sharing a panel? Do they obliterate the original designs, or are they on there beside them, not covering them? And it's usually that latter one that we find. So why are they reusing these, and how is this? Are these ethnically European ranchers coming into the mesa, using the land, seeing the existing images, but not replacing them? Or are they made by Native Americans, by members of the Pueblos, like perhaps the nearest Pueblo, Oke-Awinge? Are they perhaps Pueblo peoples raising livestock to start participating in this very sort of Western cash economy? One of the ways we might go about answering that question is looking for other images around this period that also show that sort of use of old techniques, old panels, and new images. which I have examples of. And this is where we get into another one of our favorite things to talk about, are our heraldic lion images. So these are made with that same pecking technique, a very Native American technique. Not, I mean, pecking is used around the world, but it's still the technique of the people residing around here. But these are renditions of heraldic lions, specifically Spanish heraldic lions. They've got crowns, and then the telltale thing is that S shape in the see that S shape in the tail. Both of these have it. So we have several of these, and it's quite confounding, because we can even, our members of our project have even found parallels between Spanish goods like this silver belt buckle and the heraldic lions carved at the Mesa. So again, is that Spanish or is that Pueblo? Well, it's getting the general vibe of the lion, but it's still very stylized in a way that kind of appears Pueblo. And then we get things like this. So we think it's a heraldic lion because it has the toes, and the mane is indicated by the hair as sort of rays around the head. And yet this is still in a very Rio Grande style, classic period style of rock image. Something that you might notice about this is that there's a snake crossing the neck. We're not quite sure if that's put on at the same time or not, but if we run with the idea that it was, then it might be a sign of aggression towards the bearers of this images, the bearers of this heraldic lion. So early in the Spanish colonial period, we're seeing a mixture of images, and we're seeing reflections of that tension between economic cooperation and violent conflict, indications of both of them. So we actually see that in the images, as well as know it from the written and oral histories of the time. So Mesa Prieta was not just a passive player in the Spanish colonial period. However, we weren't just some part of the far outliers of the Spanish Empire. We were on major trade routes, and those major trade routes, the interior El Camino Real would be one of them, and the other would be what we now call the Old Spanish Trail. Fittingly enough, I guess, and this Old Spanish Trail, the Old Spanish Trail links Los Angeles to Santa Fe, and El Camino Real starts at the interior El Camino Real. It starts basically on the site of a pueblo at the foot of the Mesa, where a hacienda was established in around 1703, and then runs all the way down to Mexico City. Now, these trails often were established, like El Camino Real, based on pre-existing trade networks. So then we have to think again about how much is there a continuity between the historic period and the post-contact period and the pre-contact. do we see? So we have these written records uh, um, mapping El Camino Real going from Mesa Prieta all the way down to Mexico City. Do we have evidence of contact along that route during pre-contact times? Well, if we look at the classic period, the short answer is yes. In fact, if we look a little bit before the classic period, we see that ancestors of the people who lived who lived near Mesa Prieta, but at the time lived in other areas like around Mesa Verde, they had trade contacts with Mexico. So we get things like cacao used for making chocolate. We get macaw feathers, probably live birds, live macaws that came up to areas like Chaco and Mesa Verde. And it's those people that lived at the foot of Mesa Prieta and made the petroglyphs after doing a bit of moving and sort of forming new communities with the people who were established there. So the point being is that the Spanish, I mean, like these Spanish trade routes, these Spanish roadways, they became so useful because they were already existing trade routes. They were a bit of infrastructure that the Spanish Empire could actually utilize, and we're sitting on two of them, on the old Spanish Trail and on El Camino Real, sort of where they do this. We're more like that: El Camino Real, old Spanish Trail. And that's not all of them during the post-contact period too, right? Okay, so we have those established, and then later on, so we have Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, and then just a few short decades later, there's this Mexican-American War. I keep wanting to say Spanish-American War, different war. The Mexican-American War. And during the Mexican-American War, there were battles fought around here. This is getting back to infrastructure and connections, but it's important to stop on these battles too, because if we imagine it was a major conflict with the U.S. Army and local residents who wanted to remain at least independent of the U.S. in 1847. We call that the Battle of Embudo. The Battle of Embudo happened on the old Spanish Trail. And you see the callback, right? So yeah, we have the Battle of Embudo on the old Spanish Trail. Shortly after the Battle of Embudo, New Mexico is annexed by the United States. Battle of Embudo, 1847. Annexation is 1848. Well, it's finally official. The resistance is done in 1848. Also in the 19th century, after annexation of New Mexico, the U.S. built a rail line coming down from Colorado down to Santa Fe. We call that the Chile Line. And for those of you who may have gone up and down Taos Canyon before, you can actually still see the old cut of, gone up the canyon to Taos, right? So the old rail line cut is on the opposite side of the river from the road, and you can see it, and it runs along the foot of the mesa, and the pueblos at the foot of the mesa were important stops on the Chile Line when it was first built. So how does the Chile Line relate to the mesa? How does it relate to the rock art of the mesa? Well, for those of you who have done our tours before, if you have done, we call it Trail 3, the trail with our logo on it, Flute Player Hollow. See a lot of these guys on there. As you're descending down into Flute Player Hollow, there is a boulder with scrape marks on it. Just these horizontal scrape marks. We have a hypothesis, and so far it's really our only hypothesis for it, so I would definitely call it the leading one, that these scrape marks are... Excuse me. Should have silenced my phone. We have these scrape marks along this boulder that we believe are from the end nuts on axles of carts going down, taking livestock from the mesa down to the Chile line. And so that ties us back into the rock art. So now we've gone with the rock art from the pre-contact classic period through Spanish colonial period and talked about how there's this transition, how there's this continuity of old techniques, mixture of Spanish images, this gradual changing of how the mesa is used to integrate with the sort of cash economy, so then we have this ranching sort of done for profit, basically, rather than for subsistence, right? So they're raising sheep with the cattle brands or livestock brands, like I showed you, as trade goods coming down on carts to the Chile line. So we're seeing this continuity also between the Spanish colonial period and the American territorial times. We tend to lump American territorial and American statehood generally into one period, at least when we're talking about the Mesa, because then we don't really see a lot of Anglophone, English-speaking influence until later. Until 1938 is when we have the clearest stuff of English speakers coming in with the Works Progress Administration. And the Chile line is before that. So we've got the sort of fantastic, these examples of this gradual shifting change and continuity, of continuity despite all this change going on for several centuries during post-contact times. So yeah, that about wraps up what I was going to say about the Mesa post-contact. And we've got another question. In the known petroglyph record, are there any patterns that have emerged? For example, has there been a concentration of a particular symbol or icon or repetition in variations of others? So the livestock brands are a great example of an image that's repeated. And we tend to see potential. Again, we still haven't quite confirmed for sure because the records that have been available are post-date the period we think that these particular petroglyphs are from. But it looks like that the what we're calling livestock brands, and they'll be repeated pretty continuously here. We'll grab a little notebook here. One that we're seeing is this. Oh, that's too bright. Okay. Never mind. Yes, and it did change. It did change by time and period. So that would be an example of something that was repeated during post-contact times. It's the livestock brands, and where these concentrations are differs from the parts of the mesa that were used before it, because we tend to find them at the edges of what's good pasture land, which sort of adds to this this hypothesis of livestock brands. I'm sorry, my dog is going crazy outside. Poor thing. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. But one of the images or types of images that we have repeated during pre-contact times, during the classic period, is when we get a lot of flute players. We have human flute players, we have animal flute players, and we also see those concentrated in areas. And that's actually a great segue into my own research interests. Because if you think about these flute players, this is, while it's an image, it's an inherently musical one, right? Right. Divided attention here. I'm trying to bring this up. And that the just straight up answer to that would be, oh no. Okay. It's not displaying properly. One of the areas that we see these is in hollows, bowls in the geographic term, sides to things. Also in, I'm not sure if you can really call them canyons. They're so small, but we do have these cracks, and we believe are the mesa slumping, but it's also been suggested they're collapsed lava tubes. But you've got vertical walls sort of facing each other, but usually the topography of the mesa is more not quite vertical boulder piles. But when you get two piles across from each other with a sort of flat space in between, and that's where we start to see the fluke. And that's where my research is I am I'm an archaeoacoustician. I am developing methods for quantifying how we describe archaeological spaces and testing these spaces for acoustical properties. And because I do a scientific approach, I always make sure that I have a control, that I look for a landscape of similar form. It's got to be the same substrate, the same bedrock outcrops, but that doesn't have petroglyphs, and then quantify the properties of the sound at that. And I've got some examples that I'd like to show from previous areas that I've worked. We've begun doing this kind of research at Mesa Prieta, but it's all very preliminary at this point. So one of the things that we, if we're to do archaeoacoustics, echoes are one of course, the first things. But echoes are just one aspect of sound reflections. So we've got your basic echo. I don't know if you can hear my dog barking, but there is a slight echo from my dog's barks off the fence at the property boundary and then back. And it's just like a great example, right? If you get multiple echoes arriving close enough together, then that's what we call reverb. And that's when they arrive so close together that the human mind can't really process them as separate signals. It can't separate the individual echoes. So it's kind of like when you're watching a video like this one, it's actually a series of still frames or partial still frames, and it only appears to be moving because you're getting this rapid succession visually. Same thing happens audibly. When you get that rapid succession, that gives you sort of the audio equivalent of, sort of the echo equivalent of a moving video. It's when you're getting into the territory of reverb. We probably have reverb in these spaces where we have the flute players. We certainly have strong echoes. And one of the things to consider about that is how is someone going to play musically? Okay, so that the quantifiable stuff is like the intensity of the echo, the delay, whether it's reverb, and then what we call the RT60 value for reverb, which is just it's a measure of the duration and intensity of reverb. Is it kind of short and weak? Is it longer? That's what we call the RT60. And so in spaces with good reverb, when you're playing a flute, you're going to hear the notes that you've just played echoing back. Sometimes in some places these can, so now we're getting out of the quantitative and more into the qualitative side of things. They can appear, or they can sound like they're arriving even out of order. which allows you to sort of harmonize with yourself. You can play a whole chord by moving between the notes of the chord and playing back off of what's reflected back in that reverb. And when we have these complex spaces, like I said, we're fewer vertical walls and more almost not quite vertical boulder walls. There's a lot of little surfaces just kind of receding back, each echoing, and each further back echo is going to arrive later. So that allows you to sort of harmonize with what you're playing. And then the next thing, I don't think this is going to display well, honestly, but yeah. So this is an examination of sound at another area I've worked. And what you see in the sort of long oval boxes, this is a graph of the sounds. We've got frequency going up, time going out here, and I analyzed it for where the most intense frequencies are. If we can find a mathematical relationship between those, then we've got what we call resonance. Resonance is what happens when reverb is sort of selected for based on specific tones, and those tones are, each tone corresponds with a wavelength, the discrete length of the sound wave. And the ones that you're going to find when you do have resonance are going to be an integer multiple of the space, or yeah, they're going to repeat a whole number of times over the span of the space that you're observing them in. That's really special. We might have spaces with that, but it's echo and reverb. And so echo and reverb are something that seems to have been preferred during the pre-contact classic Rio Grande Pueblo period. It does not seem to be something that people really cared about in the post-contact period. We don't really see a correlation between these post-contact images, Christian crosses, cruciforms, if you will, or crucifixes, or cattle brands, or pictures of horses, pictures of carts. We don't really see these necessarily frequently corresponding or only corresponding with places with strong echoes. So that's another way in which the use of the space where the petroglyphs are changes, and thus implies a change in the purpose of the petroglyphs. So yeah, but the jury is still out on that, and a lot of this is untested. So I'm definitely going based on anecdotal evidence, especially if we're going to talk about something like horse images. We're only now starting to get large enough of a sample of horse images to start to look for spatial patterns, and honestly, we really haven't yet. So this can be a future question. Do we see things? We know that in rock images around the world, hoofed animals, not always, but are more frequently associated with spaces that echo. So when we have this new hoofed animal in the area, we can ask, well, do horse images appear in places where there are echoes? Because we really haven't asked that yet. But horses aren't the first hoofed animals around here. We've pretty much always had bighorn sheep, deer, elk, and we do see images of deer and elk. We see images of elk tracks. So are we getting, where do those occur? Do those occur in spaces where the hoof prints or where the hoofbeats would have made an echo? Or do they appear in these spaces for other reasons? Do they appear here because this was a trail? Do they appear here because this was a trail not for elk, but for people, and that the elk is a metaphor? Do they appear here for some other reason? Does the elk hoof carry another meaning aside from walking or an echoey sound? What other meanings can it carry? And yeah, looking at how they're distributed around space is one way of approaching that. One of the other things that that we also use to make these interpretations is to examine the sorts of artifacts that we're finding in the spaces and whether we're finding constructed features. In the instances of the cattle brands, we are finding we're also finding constructed low rock walls. We're finding sort of circular cleared areas as well as established trails. So it looks like that they were building, probably the rock walls were topped with a brush fence on top to keep your livestock in. Not really sure what the circular structures are, but they seem to be related. So these are clues into how the place was used. So when we're looking at the artifacts, if we're to look back into the classic period, what sort of artifacts are we finding? Well, mostly what's left, types of pottery that we find. Do we find pottery with different purposes, different ages, or is it really our existence building this wonderful data set that that we are opening up to research of having enough of a data set to be able to start to ask these questions. So it's actually going to be really fun to, moving forward here, look at not just, of course, we're going to continue recording. And that's an amazing thing. And we have amazingly enthusiastic volunteers. I was astounded with how much enthusiasm we had for volunteers this year, for volunteer recorders this year. And I really hope that continues. But now we also have these records that they've been working for so many years to build, and we can go back and examine those records and really look at what these patterns are between the types of images that we see, the way that they're made, the periods they come from, and the types of artifacts and constructed things that we find all together. And these are all just many pieces of a very complicated puzzle. So yeah, we're very fortunate to have a huge data set. We're very fortunate to have research. I'm not the only researcher here. We recently had research come out from from my predecessor, Janet McKenzie, our former project archaeologist and former project director, who co-published with our lead recording volunteer or the person who's been our lead recording volunteer for years, Candace Borduin. They published on Archaic period rock art, which I haven't even touched in this talk. So wonderful to have that interest. And we have other scholars, particularly with a commercial firm, that are interested in doing research. So we are looking forward to this partnership and other sorts of partnerships of this nature, and to making our established data set and database better known and available to, say, university students. So yeah, we've got a wealth of information. Very fortunate for that. And it's been talking for 53 minutes, and I've only just begun to scratch the surface. So thank you everyone who tuned in, and anyone who's still on the stream now. Very much appreciate your questions. I hope I answered them satisfactorily and not too roundabout of a way. We are looking forward to doing more content like this. In the future, we'll probably, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this, we've got some exciting things to come up. So, yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, stay tuned for more updates. Check out the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project Facebook page. Of course, we also announce events on our webpage as well, mesaprietapetroglyphs.org. And yeah, stay tuned for more.